Hello, this video will be about flooding. So what is a flood? A flood is simply when water is piling up on the land, and that's because the water can no longer absorb the water. Now, the reason the water or the land can no longer absorb any more water is because that land has become saturated. If it's saturated, that means the ground is completely filled with water and it can't hold any more. Areas that are most prone to flooding are what we call floodplains. These are simply the lower lying areas that are near rivers. So if you live right next to the Tar River, for example, your house is more prone to flooding because you live by a floodplain. Remember, water is always going to lower lying areas because gravity is what's moving it. So if you live in a floodplain, it's very flat, usually very close to a body of water, and it's typically a little bit lower in elevation than the closer areas around. There are different types of floods. One type of flood is called a flash flood. A flash flood is simply a flood that happens very quickly and is over very quickly. Different things can influence whether or not you have a flash flood. For example, you could have very heavy rain that happens very, very quickly. So if all of a sudden it just starts pouring rain and rain is coming down faster than what the ground can absorb, that is what will lead to a flash flood. The surface conditions. So if you have a lot of rain in an area where there's pavement and concrete, such as an urban area, you're going to be more likely to have flash flooding. And then topography. Topography, if you remember from Unit 1, is simply the shape of the land, the elevation. So if you live in an area that's a lower elevation, such as like New Orleans, or you live in the valley of a mountain, you are more likely to have flash flooding because all of the rain will wash down the mountain into the area where you are. And then lastly, urbanization. And this simply goes back to the surface conditions. If you have urbanized areas, you have more of the concrete and the pavement, like I said earlier, and that just lets flash floods build up. So flash floods, just very little warning, very, very quickly, pours down rain, a smaller scale area may flood, but then that flood typically goes away much quicker. Hurricanes lead to actual flooding. Flash floods will just be very short, very small scale, very quick, but can still be very dangerous. Factors that are going to influence flooding: rain intensity and duration. So how hard is it raining and how long is it going to rain for? Surface conditions: do you have a lot of vegetation or dirt around that can absorb it? Topography and urbanization, just like I already explained, that not only influences flash floods, but just any flooding in general. In urban areas, constructions of buildings, highways, and parking lots increase runoff, and they reduce infiltration. So below you can see some pictures of flooding that have occurred. These could be flash floods that have happened. In this picture over here, you can see there was a hill, and so the lower part of the hill is where this flash flood has occurred. And then right here you can see how the flooding, it could be affecting the street, but not the whole city. But the pavement has prevented this water from being able to be absorbed, and so the ground has simply flooded instead. Brain break. This is actually just a really cool video if you want to watch it. It's a TED Talk, but don't roll your eyes at the fact it's a TED Talk. It's this guy who's like a beatboxer, and he can just manipulate his voice in a lot of different ways. So it's very, very cool. I highly recommend watching it if you are kind of bored and want to watch something else. But then you do have to come back to my video so you can get the rest of this information. So other activities that can cause flooding are removing of wetlands. Wetlands are super important for many different reasons. One reason wetlands are important is they act like a sponge. So wetland is simply an area that's wet for all or most of the year. These are going to be like your swamps and marshes. And the reason they're wet for the majority of the year is simply because, like a sponge, they absorb water and they keep it there. So if you have wetlands, then water will get absorbed and stay there rather than flooding areas that we live in. Wetlands are very important in terms of the amount of wildlife they support. They have lots of different plants, so they have a lot of biodiversity and a lot of animals and species that call that home. So they're important for preventing flooding and for ecosystems. Here's a few pictures of wetlands. As you can see, you've probably seen wetlands before and just didn't realize it. But you got like swamps and marsh type areas. So protection against water pollution, one way to protect against it is to protect your wetlands. Wetlands not only prevent flooding and provide a home to many animals, they also clean water. Wetlands are one of the only natural cleaning sources that we have on this planet. So the water will drain into the wetland. The wetland holds it, and some of the water will be clean because it filters through the dirt. But other parts, the actual plants in the wetland, will filter out toxic metals and things like that and clean the water. So wetlands protect against pollution and they prevent flooding. Some wetlands are natural, like your marshes. Other wetlands are man-made. There's actually rules, and I don't know the exact rule, but if you are building, so you have a lot of apartments or shopping centers or things nearby, for a certain amount of people that will be in the area, you have to have a wetland to help contain floods and to help with some of that pollution. So if you are a contractor and you've built a major apartment complex or neighborhood, you actually have to go in and build these little retention ponds around. And these are just some examples of what they may look like, whether they've been built or are being built, so you can see. You've probably seen them before. But again, this is important because the more pavement you have, the more runoff and the more flooding. So the wetlands, man-made or natural, they will help prevent some of that flooding and reduce some of that pollution from that urban runoff that you get. And let's see. This is just some more detail on why wetlands are so good for preventing your flooding. So the trees and roots and vegetation that are around it, they slow the spread of flood water, and the slower the moving the water, the more it's able to infiltrate the ground, and therefore not flood because it's absorbing. It also prevents erosion, because the more dirt you have, the more water can be absorbed into the dirt. So the more plants, the less erosion you have, causing there to be more of a sponge to absorb that water. And wetlands have so much vegetation, it helps with both of those things. This is what I was saying about the roots and vegetation. They just help to get the pollution out because they can settle it where the water infiltrates, leaving pollution behind. Or some plants will actually remove the pollution altogether and absorb it into themselves. So it's important to keep your wetlands clean because you don't want to overload them with pollution because that can kill those plants. You want them just to take what's naturally coming to that area. So can anything good come from a flood? We know a lot of bad things can happen. Property damage, people can die, but there actually are some good things. So when you have floods, it actually increases the nutrients in the soil. So if it's flooding that's near a body of water, it'll take the silt from the river and move it onto the shoreline and the floodplains, making those areas very fertile in terms of plant growth. It can also recharge groundwater. Now, when we say recharge groundwater, that's the same thing as saying it just refills it. So it's letting the groundwater that could have been drained from overuse be filled back up. So those are two good things that it can cause. The bad things, it can kill people and cause a lot of property damage. If your house has been flooded, it's very hard to recover from that. Typically, you have to just go in and rebuild because it can do so much damage. But floodwaters also can spread diseases, so that's another way that they are very dangerous. And this is just a brain break. If you want to try to move your left hand up and down while moving your right hand side to side at the same time, and then you can try vice versa. Just kind of an interesting thing to try out, kind of challenging. So now we're going to look at ways to prevent flooding. Now, you already should be familiar with levees because we did a lab where you built a levee. But remember, a levee is simply something that it's an embankment built up on the sides of a river that help the river to hold more water in order to prevent flooding. So you have natural levees or you have artificial levees. So this top picture is showing a man-made levee that was built up, and the bottom picture shows a natural levee. The way you get a natural levee is it will flood, and when it floods, it takes the dirt from the river and puts it on the river bank. And then the more the river floods, the higher it builds those up. Now, eventually, it will stop the river from flooding because the river would have to get extremely high in order to go over that embankment. But those are what your levees will do. Another way to prevent flooding is with a flood control dam. Flood control dams, dams we know block water, But with a flood control dam, you're actually controlling the speed water is released. So it can store up a bunch of water, and then they'll open the dam to allow water to slowly leak out of it. Because again, the slower water enters an area, the more likely that place is able to handle that water, letting it infiltrate, letting it spread out rather than to flood. Quick water is what causes flooding. Slowly released water helps minimize flooding and prevent it. So places like Raleigh that have water before it gets to us, it will contain all that water in the dam, and then before the dam overflows, it will open it, let just little bits of water out at a time. That way the flooding isn't as bad as it would have been had they just poured all the water out at once. And another way that we can prevent flooding is simply by making sure we have as much vegetation present as possible. Plants prevent erosion, and like I said earlier, the more dirt you have, the more area water is able to be absorbed into the ground, preventing the erosion or flooding. So no soil or plants, you don't have anything to hold that water, which will just then cause more flooding to occur. This is another brain games. So if you like the brain games we did on another one, then you can click this link and do some fun little challenges with your mind, see how well you can keep up with things. And 1 second. Okay, so the opposite of a flood is when you have a drought. A flood is when you have too much water coming in all at once. A drought is when you don't have enough water. So we typically call it a shortage of water. There's two things that can cause a drought. One, it could be because you don't have enough rain, so that would be a dry climate. You haven't gotten enough rain in the area to meet the water needs that you have. Another thing that could cause it is simply you're not able to get to the water you do have. So lack of money to drill deep wells or to build dams in order to store your water. If you have water but can't get to it, it's no good to you. So that can be called a water shortage. Even though it's there, you can't get to it. And then the biggest thing is what we call water stress. So water stress is when you use more water than what you have. This is caused by overpopulation or by people not conserving water. Remember, we said we do have water balance, meaning global precipitation is equal to evaporation, but that is global, not local. So in a local area, say Greenville, say we need, this certain amount of water. But if people are using more than what we have available, we therefore don't have enough water for everybody. And so that's still considered a drought. That was simply called by water stress. But all of those things can lead to a drought. So how do you prevent a drought? Well, you can conserve water. You can't control the weather, but you can control how much water you're using. So if you don't overuse your water, then it's more likely that we will have enough water for the rest of the population. Remember, conservation practices are going to be things like shorter showers, not running the water when you brush your teeth. I know some of you may turn the water on in the shower to let it heat up, but you let the water run for like 15 minutes before you actually get in the shower. Things like that all waste water. So just be mindful of the amount of water that you're using and when you use it. And that is all for this video. I'll go ahead and end this, and next we will look at ocean currents and tides.